What if the greatest military mind of World War II saw the next war coming before the ink dried on the surrender documents? What if a four-star general tried to warn his superiors that their Soviet allies would become their deadliest enemies, only to be dismissed, silenced, and ultimately destroyed? The story you're about to hear isn't just about military strategy or political foresight. It's about a man who dared to speak an inconvenient truth at precisely the wrong moment in history and paid the ultimate price for his clarity of vision. George S. Patton stood in the ruins of Berlin in the summer of 1945, watching Soviet soldiers loot, rape, and brutalize their way through defeated Germany. While politicians in Washington and London celebrated their alliance with Stalin, Patton saw something entirely different. He saw the next enemy, he saw the next war, and he understood, with a certainty that haunted his final months, that America had just helped the wrong side win. This wasn't paranoia or instability speaking. This was a warrior who had spent 4 years studying his enemy and had just realized that the real enemy had been standing beside him the entire time, waiting for the Germans to fall before turning their guns westward. The establishment called him reckless. They said he was mentally unstable, suffering from combat fatigue, unable to adjust to peacetime realities. They relieved him of command, isolated him from power, and when he persisted in his warnings, they effectively silenced him. Less than 6 months after voicing his concerns about Soviet intentions, George Patton was dead under circumstances that remain suspicious to this day. But here's what they couldn't silence. His predictions came true, every single one of them. The Cold War, the Berlin Blockade, the Iron Curtain, the decades of nuclear standoff. Patton saw it all coming in 1945, and nobody wanted to listen. George Smith Patton Jr. was born on November 11, 1885, into a family steeped in military tradition. His grandfather fought for the Confederacy and died at Winchester. His great-uncle served with distinction. The Patton family breathed warfare, honor, and an almost mystical connection to combat that transcended normal military service. Young George grew up hearing tales of cavalry charges and battlefield glory, internalizing a warrior ethos that seemed anachronistic even in his own time. He was a throwback to an earlier age, a man who believed in destiny, reincarnation, and the nobility of warfare in an era increasingly skeptical of such romantic notions. But Patton was no simple romantic. He graduated from West Point in 1909, competed in the 1912 Olympics in the modern pentathlon, and became one of the first officers to recognize the revolutionary potential of tank warfare. While other generals clung to horses and bayonets, Patton saw that mechanized warfare would define 20th century combat. He studied Hannibal, Caesar, and Napoleon with religious fervor, convinced that he himself had fought in ancient battles in previous lives. His contemporaries found this belief bizarre, but it gave Patton something invaluable, a sense of historical continuity that allowed him to see patterns others missed. By 1945, Patton had become America's most celebrated field commander. His Third Army had raced across France with unprecedented speed, relieved Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, and driven deep into Germany with an aggressive ferocity that both awed and disturbed his superiors. He had saved thousands of American lives through his philosophy of violent, rapid offensive action. "The object of war is not to die for your country," he famously declared, "but to make the other bastard die for his." This wasn't mere bravado. It was strategic genius translated into blood and mud. But victory brought Patton face to face with a reality that shattered his celebratory mood. As his forces pushed eastward into Czechoslovakia and Bavaria, they began encountering Soviet troops moving westward. What Patton observed in those encounters fundamentally altered his understanding of the war's outcome. He saw brutality on a scale that shocked even a man who had witnessed 4 years of combat carnage. Soviet soldiers were systematically raping German women, young and old, girls and grandmothers. They were looting everything not nailed down. They were executing suspected Nazi collaborators without trial, often based on mere accusations from rival villagers settling old scores. This wasn't liberation, it was conquest. And Patton, with his deep historical knowledge, recognized it immediately for what it was: the beginning of a new empire's expansion, not the end of an old one's defeat. While American newspapers printed photographs of smiling GIs shaking hands with Soviet soldiers at the Elbe River, Patton saw Soviet officers marking maps, noting strategic positions, and preparing for a conflict they clearly anticipated. He watched as Red Army units occupied territory, established military governments, and began implementing communist political structures with a speed and organization that betrayed extensive pre-planning. The moment that crystallized Patton's understanding came during a meeting with Soviet generals in occupied territory. The Russians were courteous, even friendly on the surface, but Patton, who had spent his entire life studying warfare and warriors, recognized something in their demeanor that chilled him. These weren't men celebrating peace, they were professionals assessing future adversaries. One Soviet general, during a casual conversation about armored tactics, asked pointed questions about American tank production capabilities and logistical support structures. Patton understood immediately that he wasn't making conversation. He was gathering intelligence for future operations. That evening, Patton made a decision that would define his final months and ultimately contribute to his downfall. He decided to speak the truth as he saw it, regardless of political consequences. This was characteristic of Patton throughout his career, but never before had the timing been so catastrophically poor. America was exhausted from 4 years of war. The public wanted demobilization, not new threats. Politicians wanted to maintain the alliance with Stalin, believing they could negotiate lasting peace. The last thing Washington wanted was a popular general undermining official policy by declaring our ally to be our next enemy. Patton's family background had instilled in him a sense of martial honor that transcended practical considerations. The Patton men had always spoken their minds, fought for their beliefs, and accepted the consequences. His grandfather had died for the Confederacy, knowing the cause was likely lost. His father had instilled in him the belief that honor mattered more than advancement. This heritage gave Patton both his greatest strength and his fatal weakness, the courage to speak truth regardless of consequences, but also an inability to compromise or moderate his positions when political survival required it. The contrast between Patton's worldview and the emerging post-war consensus couldn't have been starker. American leadership in 1945 was dominated by men who believed in rational negotiation, international law, and the possibility of peaceful coexistence between different political systems. They had witnessed the carnage of 2 world wars and desperately wanted to believe that institutional frameworks like the United Nations could prevent future conflicts. They saw Stalin as a pragmatist who could be negotiated with, whose suspicions could be allayed through concessions and reassurances. Patton saw none of this. He saw power, will, and the brutal logic of imperial expansion. He recognized that Stalin respected only strength and would exploit any weakness. He understood that communist ideology wasn't simply Russian nationalism, but a comprehensive worldview that viewed capitalism as an enemy requiring destruction. He knew that the Soviet system, having survived the German onslaught through ruthless discipline and total mobilization, was capable of sustained military competition that would test Western resolve for decades. To understand why Patton saw what others missed in 1945, you need to understand the experiences that shaped his military thinking. Unlike many American generals who rose through peacetime ranks and administrative positions, Patton had actively sought combat throughout his career. In 1916, he participated in the punitive expedition into Mexico, hunting Pancho Villa, personally leading a raid that killed several Villa supporters in a gunfight. He kept the saddles from the horses of the men he killed, morbid trophies that revealed his intensely personal connection to warfare. During World War I, Patton commanded the newly formed U.S. Tank Corps, personally leading tanks into battle at San Miguel and the Meuse-Argonne offensive. He was wounded in the hip by machine gun fire while rallying his men on foot, refusing evacuation until his tanks were reorganized. This wasn't leadership from a command post, it was leadership from the front lines, sharing the danger and death alongside his men. That experience taught Patton something crucial. Warfare is fundamentally about will, about which side can maintain offensive momentum through casualties and chaos. Between the wars, while other officers enjoyed comfortable garrison postings, Patton immersed himself in military history and theory. He read every campaign history he could find. He studied maps of Hannibal's route across the Alps. He analyzed Napoleon's movement tables and supply calculations. He developed theories about armored warfare that were years ahead of contemporary thinking. When other American officers dismissed tanks as supporting weapons for infantry, Patton envisioned independent armored formations striking deep behind enemy lines, disrupting supply networks and command structures. But Patton's education extended beyond books and maps. He traveled extensively through Europe in the 1930s, witnessing firsthand the rise of totalitarian movements. He observed Hitler's Germany, Mussolini's Italy, and Stalin's Soviet Union with growing alarm. Unlike many American observers who viewed these systems through ideological lenses, Patton saw them through a military lens. He recognized that totalitarian states organized entirely around military expansion represented existential threats to democratic nations that valued peace and commerce. More importantly, he understood that such states couldn't simply be contained or negotiated with. They had to be decisively defeated. When World War II began, Patton was already in his 50s, seemingly past his prime for field command, but the North African campaign revealed that he was perfectly suited for the mobile, mechanized warfare that defined the conflict. After the disaster at Kasserine Pass, where inexperienced American forces were routed by Rommel's Afrika Korps, Patton took command of the demoralized the II Corps and transformed it in a matter of weeks. He didn't do this through gentle encouragement or modern psychological approaches. He did it through fierce discipline, personal courage, and an absolute refusal to accept anything less than victory. The Sicily campaign showcased both Patton's brilliance and his flaws. He raced across the island with such speed that British commander Bernard Montgomery, a methodical planner, was left far behind. Patton understood that in warfare, speed itself is a weapon. It prevents the enemy from establishing defensive positions, disrupts their decision-making, and creates psychological panic. But Sicily also brought the infamous slapping incidents, where Patton struck two soldiers suffering from combat fatigue, accusing them of cowardice. The incidents nearly ended his career, forcing him to apologize and temporarily removing him from command. Those slapping incidents reveal something crucial about Patton's worldview. He genuinely believed that every man could overcome fear through willpower, because he himself had overcome his own considerable fears through force of will. Patton suffered from dyslexia, making reading difficult and causing him tremendous anxiety about appearing stupid. He overcame this through relentless study and memorization. He experienced genuine terror in combat, but trained himself to push through it. In his mind, if he could conquer his weaknesses, any man could. What he failed to understand was that not everyone possessed his extraordinary force of personality, and that psychiatric casualties were as real as physical wounds. The European campaign from D-Day through Germany's surrender was Patton's masterpiece. His Third Army liberated more territory and captured more prisoners than any comparable force. When German forces trapped American units at Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, Patton executed a military maneuver of extraordinary difficulty, pivoting his entire army 90 degrees north and attacking through brutal winter conditions in under 48 hours. It was a feat of logistical genius and personal will that military historians still study as an example of operational excellence. Throughout these campaigns, Patton developed an increasingly sophisticated understanding of Soviet capabilities and intentions. Unlike most American commanders, he actually studied Soviet military doctrine and history. He knew about their performance against Finland, their initial disasters against Germany in 1941, and their eventual massive offensives that drove the Wehrmacht back to Berlin. He understood that the Red Army had learned hard lessons and evolved into a formidable force. More importantly, he recognized that Soviet political officers maintained tight control over military units, meaning the Red Army wasn't just a military force, it was a political instrument of communist expansion. By the spring of 1945, as German resistance collapsed, Patton began expressing concerns about Soviet behavior to his staff and superiors. He observed that Soviet commanders were deliberately slowing their advance to allow American and British forces to take casualties clearing German positions, then rushing forward to occupy territory once it was secured. He noted that Soviet troops were stripping conquered territories of industrial equipment and shipping it eastward. This wasn't simple looting, it was systematic economic warfare. He documented instances of Soviet forces blocking American access to certain areas and refusing to honor agreements about occupation zones. Patton's observations extended beyond military matters to the ideological foundations of Soviet behavior. He recognized that communist doctrine viewed capitalism and democracy as enemies to be destroyed, not as alternative systems to be tolerated. He understood that Stalin's cooperation with America was purely tactical, designed to defeat Germany using American resources while positioning Soviet forces to dominate post-war Europe. He saw that Soviet propaganda portrayed the Red Army as liberators, while systematically subjugating populations through terror and political indoctrination. What particularly alarmed Patton was the speed and efficiency with which Soviet forces established communist control structures. Within days of occupying territory, Soviet political officers would identify local collaborators, establish party cells, eliminate potential opposition leaders, and begin implementing economic policies designed to make populations dependent on Soviet support. This wasn't improvised occupation. It was the execution of detailed plans developed long before German surrender. Patton understood that such planning indicated Soviet leadership had anticipated post-war territorial gains and prepared to exploit them. The contrast between American and Soviet occupation policies troubled Patton deeply. American forces tried to maintain order while preparing for eventual German self-governance. They worked with existing local authorities where possible, provided humanitarian aid, and generally treated German civilians with basic decency. Soviet forces operated entirely differently. They viewed occupation as an opportunity to extract maximum economic benefit while establishing permanent political control. They shipped entire factories eastward to rebuild Soviet industry. They conscripted German workers for forced labor. They arrested anyone suspected of anti-communist sentiments. Patton's personal experiences during the final months of the war reinforced his concerns about Soviet intentions. He witnessed Soviet soldiers committing atrocities against German civilians with the apparent approval of their officers. He saw Soviet political commissars interrogating German prisoners about industrial facilities, transportation networks, and resource locations. Intelligence gathering that served no purpose in a concluded war, but would be invaluable in future conflict. He observed Soviet engineers mapping terrain, evaluating defensive positions, and assessing transportation choke points in ways that suggested preparation for military operations rather than peaceful occupation. One incident particularly affected Patton's thinking. In early May 1945, his forces liberated a concentration camp where they discovered not only German atrocities, but also evidence of Soviet atrocities against Polish officers and intellectuals. The Katyn Forest massacre, though officially blamed on Germans at the time, bore clear marks of Soviet execution methods. Patton understood that the regime capable of murdering tens of thousands of Polish officers in cold blood would not hesitate to subjugate populations through whatever means necessary. The moral equivalence between Nazi and Soviet brutality became clear to him, even though official policy required treating the Soviets as heroes and liberators. Patton's strategic analysis was informed by his understanding of geography and logistics. He recognized that Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe provided strategic depth, resources, and forward positions that dramatically improved their military posture. The territories Stalin controlled contained coal, steel, and agricultural production essential to sustaining a large military. The populations could be conscripted for labor or military service. The geography provided defensive advantages while offering multiple invasion routes into Western Europe. Allowing Stalin to consolidate control over these territories would transform the strategic balance in ways that would take decades to reverse. The personal cost of maintaining combat readiness for years had taken its toll on Patton by 1945. He was 60 years old, exhausted from years of intense campaigning, and showing signs of the stress that 4 years of warfare inflicts even on the strongest personalities. His diary entries from this period reveal a man wrestling with mortality, questioning his purpose. Now that the war he had prepared his entire life to fight was ending, he wrote about feeling obsolete, about belonging to an age of warfare that was passing, about fearing that politicians would squander the victory his soldiers had won through their blood and sacrifice. This personal context is essential to understanding Patton's increasingly reckless behavior in his final months. He wasn't simply offering professional military advice, he was fighting for what he believed was his life's purpose. If Soviet threat was ignored, if America demobilized and withdrew from Europe, if the hard lessons of warfare were forgotten in naive pursuit of peace, then everything he had fought for would be wasted. His warnings became increasingly desperate because he felt time running out, both personally and strategically. The man who had always believed in his destiny now faced the possibility that his destiny was to be ignored and dismissed. The central concept that dominated Patton's thinking in the summer of 1945 was brutally simple. America had just helped defeat the wrong enemy. This wasn't a criticism of fighting Nazi Germany. Patton despised Hitler and everything the Third Reich represented. Rather, it was a strategic assessment that by destroying Germany completely, while simultaneously strengthening the Soviet Union, America had created conditions for a far more dangerous and protracted conflict. Patton believed that Germany, despite its evil ideology, represented a containable threat. The Soviet Union, with its vast territory, massive population, ideological commitment to worldwide revolution, and now battle-hardened army, represented an existential threat to Western civilization. This perspective challenged every dominant narrative of 1945. The official American position held that the alliance with Stalin had been necessary to defeat Hitler, and that post-war cooperation with the Soviets was both possible and desirable. The Yalta Conference had established spheres of influence, and American leadership believed these agreements would be honored. The United Nations was being established as a forum for resolving disputes peacefully. The atomic bomb recently used against Japan was seen as a deterrent that would prevent future large-scale conflicts. American political leadership, exhausted from 4 years of war, desperately wanted to believe that peace was now inevitable. Patton rejected all of this as dangerous fantasy. His understanding of Soviet communism wasn't based on ideology or political philosophy. It was based on direct observation of how Soviet forces behaved in conquered territory. He saw the systematic brutality, the political commissars enforcing ideological conformity, the complete absence of individual rights or humanitarian constraints. He recognized that the Soviet system was fundamentally incompatible with Western values, and that Stalin had no intention of honoring agreements once they no longer served Soviet interests. In a series of meetings and diary entries during May and June of 1945, Patton articulated his concerns with increasing bluntness. He told his colleagues that the Red Army should be confronted immediately, while American and British forces were still mobilized and Soviet forces were at the end of extended supply lines. He argued that waiting would only allow Stalin to consolidate control over Eastern Europe and strengthen defensive positions. He pointed out that Soviet forces had captured huge stockpiles of German weapons and were already incorporating Wehrmacht units and officers into their command structure. Most controversially, he suggested that America should rearm German prisoners of war and use them in any conflict with the Soviets, arguing that the Germans had been fighting communism all along and understood the enemy. This last suggestion reveals both Patton's strategic clarity and his political tone deafness. From a purely military standpoint, his argument made sense. German soldiers were experienced, well-trained, and motivated to fight against the Soviet Union. German officers possessed detailed knowledge of Soviet tactics and weaknesses. Using them would partially solve the problem of American demobilization, reducing available forces. But from a political and moral standpoint, the suggestion was catastrophic. America had just finished a war explicitly fought to defeat Nazi Germany. The Holocaust was being discovered in all its horror. The idea of rearming Germans to fight alongside American soldiers was politically unthinkable and morally repugnant to a public that had spent 4 years being told Germans were the enemy. Patton's suggestion revealed his fundamental weakness. He was a military genius but a political amateur. He understood warfare with brilliant clarity but failed to grasp how political considerations constrained military options in a democracy. A ruler like Stalin could order strategic shifts with no concern for public opinion or moral consistency. An American general served political leadership that had to answer to voters, allies, and international opinion. What made perfect sense in Patton's military framework was impossible in the political reality of 1945, but Patton's core insight remained valid even if his proposed solution was unworkable. He understood that the ideological nature of Soviet communism meant confrontation was inevitable, and that delaying confrontation would only occur under less favorable circumstances. He was essentially arguing for preventive war, attacking the Soviet Union before it became strong enough to threaten Western Europe directly. This concept violated every principle of American political culture, which held that wars should only be fought in response to aggression, not launched preemptively based on predictions of future behavior. Patton also challenged prevailing assumptions about how to treat defeated Germany. Official American policy called for harsh punishment of Germany through deindustrialization, denazification, and occupation. The Morgenthau Plan, though never fully implemented, envisioned reducing Germany to an agricultural economy incapable of future military production. Patton thought this was strategically insane. He argued that a strong, prosperous Germany was necessary to prevent Soviet expansion westward. He advocated for rebuilding German industry, incorporating reformed Germans into governance, and treating Germany as a future ally rather than a permanent enemy. This position put Patton at odds with virtually everyone in American leadership. The prevailing view held that German militarism had caused 2 world wars and must be permanently destroyed. The discovery of concentration camps had hardened opinion against showing any mercy to Germany. The Soviet Union was demanding harsh treatment of Germany as compensation for the massive destruction Germany had inflicted on Soviet territory. Patton's sympathy for German civilians and his willingness to work with former Nazi officials in occupied Bavaria confirmed his critics' suspicions that he was politically unreliable and possibly sympathetic to fascism. In reality, Patton's position had nothing to do with sympathy for Nazism, which he genuinely despised. His position was purely strategic, based on his assessment of what would be necessary to contain Soviet expansion. He saw the geopolitical chessboard clearly. Eastern Europe was already lost to Soviet control. Western Europe was exhausted and vulnerable, and only a strong Germany could serve as a bulwark against further Soviet advances. His critics saw moral imperatives and political necessities. Patton saw military realities and strategic requirements. Neither side could communicate effectively with the other because they were operating from fundamentally different premises. The deeper philosophical issue underlying Patton's conflict with his superiors involved competing theories about the nature of totalitarian threats. American political leadership, influenced by liberal internationalist thinking, believed that international institutions, economic interdependence, and diplomatic engagement could moderate Soviet behavior. They thought Stalin's cooperation during the war indicated he could be a reasonable partner in maintaining post-war peace. They assumed Soviet behavior was driven primarily by legitimate security concerns about future German aggression, and that addressing those concerns through territorial adjustments and security guarantees would satisfy Soviet ambitions. Patton understood totalitarianism differently. He recognized that ideologically driven regimes operated according to internal logic that external incentives couldn't easily modify. Soviet communism wasn't simply Russian nationalism with socialist characteristics. It was a comprehensive worldview that viewed capitalism and democracy as enemies requiring elimination. Stalin wasn't a pragmatist who could be satisfied with reasonable territorial gains. He was a revolutionary who would pursue expansion until stopped by superior force. Negotiations wouldn't moderate Soviet behavior because Soviet goals were unlimited, constrained only by practical considerations about military capability. This understanding made Patton deeply skeptical of diplomatic solutions. He watched American and British diplomats negotiate with Soviet representatives and saw that the Soviets agreed to everything, then violated agreements whenever convenient. He observed that Soviet propaganda portrayed every American or British concern as evidence of capitalist hostility, while framing every Soviet violation as justified response to Western aggression. He recognized that the Soviets were fighting a political and ideological war that continued after military hostilities ended, and that Western leaders were largely oblivious to this reality. Patton's warnings about Soviet intentions extended beyond Europe to global implications. He understood that communist ideology was inherently expansionist, seeking to foment revolution worldwide. He predicted that Soviet influence would spread through Asia, potentially threatening American interests in China, Korea, and Southeast Asia. He warned that Soviet support for communist movements in colonial territories would destabilize European empires and create opportunities for Soviet expansion. He foresaw that competition with the Soviet Union would require sustained American engagement globally, not the return to isolationism many Americans desired. These predictions were remarkably prescient. Within 5 years, China fell to communist forces receiving Soviet support. Korea erupted in war when North Korean forces, equipped and trained by the Soviets, invaded the South. Vietnam began its long struggle that would eventually draw America into costly conflict. Communist insurgencies emerged throughout the developing world, often receiving Soviet material and ideological support. The global competition Patton predicted became reality, requiring American military presence and economic engagement on a scale unprecedented in peacetime. Patton's analysis of Soviet military capabilities was particularly sophisticated. He understood that the Red Army, despite taking catastrophic casualties, had learned valuable lessons from fighting Germany. Soviet commanders had mastered large-scale offensive operations, coordinating armor, artillery and infantry across vast fronts. Soviet industry had demonstrated capacity to produce weapons in enormous quantities despite repeated disruptions. Soviet soldiers had proven capable of extraordinary endurance and discipline under conditions that would break other armies. The notion that Soviet forces were simply a peasant horde armed with Western equipment was dangerously naive. More importantly, Patton recognized that Soviet political control over military forces gave them advantages that democratic militaries lacked. Soviet commanders didn't need to worry about public opinion, casualty rates, or domestic political opposition to military operations. They could accept losses that would be politically impossible in democracies. They could maintain large standing armies indefinitely without facing electoral consequences. They could pursue long-term strategic objectives without worrying about changes in political leadership disrupting military planning. These systemic advantages meant that democracies needed significant military superiority to offset Soviet willingness to accept casualties and sustain prolonged conflicts. The strategic concept Patton advocated, maintaining overwhelming military superiority to deter Soviet aggression, would eventually become the foundation of American Cold War policy. The Truman Doctrine, NATO, massive defense budgets, forward deployment of American forces, and willingness to fight proxy wars all reflected Patton's understanding that only credible military strength would prevent Soviet expansion. The tragedy was that Patton was advocating these policies in 1945 when they were politically impossible. But by the time they became official policy in the late 1940s, the strategic situation had deteriorated exactly as he predicted. Patton's proposed solution to the Soviet threat was radical, dangerous, and from his perspective, absolutely necessary. He advocated for immediate military confrontation with Soviet forces, while American armies were still mobilized in Europe, and while the atomic bomb remained an American monopoly. He believed that a short, sharp campaign could drive Soviet forces back to their pre-war borders, liberate Eastern Europe, and establish credible deterrence against future Soviet expansion. He estimated such a campaign would be costly but feasible, particularly if German forces and equipment were utilized. The military logic behind this proposal was sound in certain respects. In the summer of 1945, American forces were battle-hardened, well-equipped, and positioned throughout Western and Central Europe. The U.S. Army Air Forces had complete air superiority and the capability to strike targets deep in Soviet territory. American logistics were functioning smoothly with established supply lines. The atomic bomb had just been successfully tested and used, providing an ultimate weapon that could destroy Soviet cities and military concentrations without risking American soldiers. Soviet forces, while numerous, were at the end of extended supply lines, occupying hostile territory and dependent on equipment that was mechanically unreliable and difficult to maintain. Patton envisioned a campaign that would begin with American and British forces attacking Soviet positions in Germany and Czechoslovakia, supported by strategic bombing of Soviet logistics hubs and industrial centers. German prisoners of war would be rearmed and organized into provisional divisions under American command. The campaign would aim not to conquer the Soviet Union. Patton understood that was impossible, but to inflict sufficient casualties and destroy enough military capability that Stalin would be forced to withdraw behind Soviet borders and accept effective international oversight of Eastern Europe. The atomic bomb featured prominently in Patton's thinking, though he didn't discuss this explicitly in recorded conversations. The success of the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 demonstrated that America possessed a war-ending weapon. Patton understood that Soviet cities like Moscow, Leningrad, and Kiev could be destroyed with atomic strikes, devastating Soviet industrial capacity and potentially crippling their ability to wage prolonged war. The moral implications of using atomic weapons against Soviet civilians troubled American leadership, but Patton saw warfare in more ruthless terms. If atomic weapons could prevent a longer, more destructive conventional war, their use was strategically justified. However, Patton's proposal contained fatal flaws that his critics immediately recognized. First, American public opinion would never support a new war against a recent ally before soldiers had even returned home from the current war. The American people were exhausted, eager for demobilization, and celebrating victory. Asking them to immediately sacrifice more lives fighting the Soviet Union was politically impossible. Second, the logistical challenges of shifting from Allied cooperation to military confrontation were enormous. Soviet forces were intermixed with American forces throughout occupied Germany. Supplies, communication networks, and command structures were all based on Allied cooperation. Converting to combat operations would require weeks of preparation that would alert the Soviets and allow them to consolidate defensive positions. Third, the moral implications of attacking a nation that had suffered over 20 million casualties defeating Nazi Germany were staggering. Soviet forces had borne the brunt of German military power, destroying hundreds of German divisions and suffering casualties on a scale that dwarfed American losses. The American public knew that Soviet sacrifice had been instrumental in defeating Hitler. Attacking the Soviet Union would be seen as betrayal of an ally that had paid an enormous price for victory. The propaganda value Stalin could extract from such an attack was incalculable. He could cast the Soviet Union as victim rather than aggressor, undermining American moral authority globally. Fourth, there was no guarantee of success. Soviet forces were numerically superior in Europe, with hundreds of divisions and thousands of tanks. Soviet civilians had demonstrated extraordinary resilience during the German invasion, evacuating industries eastward and continuing production despite catastrophic losses. Soviet territory was vast enough to absorb atomic strikes without suffering total collapse. Most importantly, attacking the Soviet Union would likely drive neutral nations toward Moscow, creating a coalition against America rather than against Soviet expansion. China, though not yet communist, would likely resist American action in Europe. Middle Eastern nations would see opportunities to extract concessions. Latin American countries would face domestic pressure to distance themselves from American aggression. Patton's alternative proposal was more modest, but equally unacceptable to political leadership. Maintain American military presence in Europe indefinitely, rebuild German economic and military capacity, and establish a firm line that Soviet forces could not cross. This policy would eventually become American Cold War strategy, implemented through NATO, the Marshall Plan, and German rearmament. But in 1945, such a policy was premature. American voters demanded demobilization. The military budget was being slashed. Nobody wanted permanent military commitments in Europe. The idea of rebuilding Germany as an ally was politically toxic. What Patton fundamentally failed to grasp was that political leadership had to balance multiple competing considerations that pure military logic ignored. Maintaining alliance cohesion with Britain, France, and other democracies required consulting them about major strategic decisions. Managing domestic politics required respecting war weariness and democratic opposition to new conflicts. Establishing international legitimacy required working through institutions like the United Nations rather than engaging in unilateral military action. Patton saw these constraints as weakness and cowardice. Political leaders saw them as the necessary requirements of democratic governance. In his diary and private conversations, Patton grew increasingly bitter and reckless in his criticisms. He called President Truman weak and indecisive. He dismissed Secretary of War Henry Stimson as naive. He suggested that political leadership had betrayed American soldiers by allowing the Soviets to occupy Eastern Europe. He made statements comparing Soviet communism to Nazi fascism and suggesting that denazification was misguided persecution of anti-communist Germans. These statements were reported to Washington by officers concerned about Patton's judgment and stability. They confirmed suspicions that Patton was politically unreliable and potentially dangerous in a position of authority. Patton's frustration stemmed partly from his awareness that time was working against American interests. Every day of delay allowed Soviet forces to strengthen positions, establish political control over occupied territories, and prepare for potential conflict. He watched as Soviet engineers fortified strategic positions, as Soviet political officers purged potential opposition, as Soviet economic planners stripped territories of portable wealth. He understood that the window for effective action was closing rapidly, and that once it closed, confronting Soviet power would become exponentially more difficult and costly. His proposal for utilizing German forces reflected practical military thinking, divorced from political reality. German soldiers numbered in the millions were experienced in fighting Soviet forces, understood Soviet tactics and weaknesses, and were motivated by intense anti-communism. German officers possessed detailed intelligence about Soviet military organization, supply systems, and strategic vulnerabilities. German industry, though damaged, retained significant productive capacity that could be redirected to supporting anti-Soviet operations. From Patton's perspective, failing to utilize these assets was strategic malpractice, driven by sentiment rather than rational calculation. But Patton failed to appreciate how his proposal would be perceived by populations who had suffered under German occupation. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, France, and other nations had experienced German brutality firsthand. The discovery of concentration camps had revealed the depths of Nazi depravity. Suggesting that America partner with the perpetrators of these crimes to fight the Soviet Union was morally indefensible to people who had watched their families murdered by Germans. The political backlash from such a policy would have destroyed American leadership's credibility and fractured the Western alliance that would prove essential to containing Soviet expansion. Patton also advocated for immediate confrontation because he understood that Soviet possession of atomic weapons would fundamentally alter the strategic calculus. As long as America maintained atomic monopoly, military action against the Soviet Union carried acceptable risks. Once the Soviets developed their own atomic weapons, confrontation would risk mutual destruction on an unprecedented scale. Patton urged immediate action precisely because he understood that the window of American nuclear superiority was temporary. His prediction proved accurate. The Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb in 1949, far earlier than American intelligence had anticipated, and the era of mutually assured destruction began. The strategic concept underlying Patton's proposals was that totalitarian regimes only respect strength and will exploit perceived weakness. He believed negotiations with Stalin were futile because Stalin would honor agreements only when they served Soviet interests. He argued that credible military deterrence required both capability and demonstrated willingness to use force. He warned that if America failed to establish clear boundaries that would be defended militarily, Stalin would continue expanding until forced to stop by superior power. This theory would eventually become the foundation of containment policy, but Patton was advocating it when the intellectual and political groundwork for such a policy didn't yet exist. The personal toll of advocating these positions isolated Patton from his peers and superiors. Officers who had served with him loyally during the war began distancing themselves from his increasingly extreme statements. Eisenhower, who had protected Patton through multiple controversies, could no longer defend him publicly. Political leaders who had celebrated his military genius now viewed him as a liability. Patton found himself progressively isolated, his warnings dismissed, not because they lacked merit, but because they were politically impossible to act upon. This isolation deepened his bitterness and convinced him that political leadership was sacrificing national security for electoral convenience. The response to Patton's warnings about Soviet intentions was swift and harsh. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander and Patton's superior, was deeply troubled by Patton's statements. Eisenhower faced enormous pressure maintaining alliance cohesion while transitioning from war to occupation. He needed cooperation from Soviet commanders to manage occupied Germany effectively. Patton's inflammatory rhetoric threatened to undermine these efforts and create incidents that could escalate into conflict. Eisenhower initially tried to moderate Patton's behavior through private conversations and warnings, urging him to understand political realities and moderate his public statements. Patton either couldn't or wouldn't comply. In September 1945, he made statements to reporters comparing the Nazi Party to American political parties and suggesting that most Germans were essentially decent people who had been misled. He resisted aggressive denazification policies, arguing they were creating chaos in Bavaria and preventing reconstruction. He retained former Nazi officials in administrative positions because they had experience and expertise necessary for governance. He publicly criticized official occupation policies, essentially accusing his superiors of incompetence and naivety about communist threats. These statements created a media firestorm. American newspapers, which had celebrated Patton as a hero months earlier, now questioned his judgment and political views. Editorials suggested he had spent too long in combat and was suffering from stress or fatigue. Politicians demanded his removal. President Truman, who had little patience for insubordinate generals, authorized Eisenhower to relieve Patton of command if necessary. On October 8, 1945, Eisenhower removed Patton from command of the Third Army, reassigning him to command the 15th Army, a paper organization overseeing historical documentation with no combat role. The relief of command was devastating to Patton. The Third Army was his creation, his family, his purpose. Being removed was both professional humiliation and personal tragedy. In the weeks following his relief, Patton's diary entries reveal profound bitterness and despair. He wrote that he had been relieved for telling the truth, that politicians had sacrificed military necessity for political expediency, that history would vindicate his warnings about Soviet intentions. He also wrote increasingly about death, suggesting that he had accomplished his destiny and questioning what purpose remained for him. On December 9, 1945, Patton was seriously injured in a car accident near Mannheim, Germany. His vehicle was struck by an American military truck in circumstances that remain disputed. Patton suffered a broken neck and was paralyzed from the neck down. He survived for 12 days before dying on December 21, 1945, officially from a pulmonary embolism. He was 60 years old. The circumstances of Patton's death have generated conspiracy theories for decades. Some researchers point out inconsistencies in official accident reports. The truck driver was never seriously investigated or punished. The accident occurred on a day when Patton was scheduled to return to the United States, where he planned to speak publicly about Soviet threats. Some theorists suggest that Soviet intelligence, which was active in occupied Germany, arranged the assassination to silence an inconvenient critic. Others suggest that American intelligence, concerned about Patton's potential to undermine official policy, was involved. There is no credible evidence for these conspiracy theories. The accident was investigated, and while some details are unclear, nothing suggests intentional action rather than tragic coincidence. Patton's death was most likely exactly what it appeared to be, a traffic accident that killed a man who had survived dozens of combat situations only to die in a mundane collision. However, the timing was convenient for those who wanted Patton silenced, and the suspicion reflects how controversial Patton had become in his final months. What cannot be disputed is that Patton's warnings about Soviet intentions proved remarkably prescient. Within 2 years of his death, the Soviet Union had consolidated control over Eastern Europe, installing communist governments in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany. The Berlin Blockade of 1948 demonstrated Soviet willingness to use military pressure to achieve political objectives. The Korean War showed that communist forces would engage in direct military confrontation with American forces. The development of Soviet atomic weapons ended American nuclear monopoly. The Cold War that Patton predicted became the defining geopolitical reality for the next 45 years. Each of Patton's specific concerns was validated by subsequent events. He warned that Soviet forces would brutalize populations they controlled. The Katyn massacre, the suppression of Hungarian and Czech uprisings, and the systematic persecution of dissidents proved him right. He warned that Stalin would not honor agreements. The violations of Yalta and subsequent treaties proved him right. He warned that Soviet ideology was fundamentally expansionist. The support for communist movements worldwide proved him right. He warned that only military strength would deter Soviet aggression. The entire structure of NATO and American Cold War strategy proved him right. Yet acknowledging Patton's prophetic accuracy doesn't automatically validate his proposed solutions. Attacking the Soviet Union in 1945 would likely have produced catastrophic results. Stalin might have responded with conventional forces, creating a grinding war of attrition in Central Europe. Soviet propaganda would have portrayed America as an aggressor, potentially driving neutral nations toward Moscow. The moral authority that sustained American leadership of the democratic world would have been severely damaged. China might have allied formally with the Soviet Union, creating a massive communist bloc years earlier than actually occurred. The war might have gone nuclear, with incalculable consequences. The question becomes whether Patton's predictions required his solutions. Could American leadership have acknowledged Soviet threat while pursuing different strategies? In fact, this is precisely what eventually happened. The Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, NATO, German rearmament, and containment strategy all represented responses to Soviet threat that fell short of preventive war. These policies successfully contained Soviet expansion without the catastrophic risks of immediate military confrontation. Patton was right about the diagnosis. but possibly wrong about the treatment. However, defenders of Patton argue that earlier confrontation would have occurred when American advantages were greater. In 1945, America had atomic monopoly, battle-hardened forces in Europe, and Soviet forces were relatively weak and overstretched. By 1950, Soviet forces had been rebuilt, Eastern Europe was firmly controlled, and the Soviets had atomic weapons. By 1960, Soviet forces were modernized and capable of threatening Western Europe directly. The argument is that delay only occurred under less favorable circumstances, exactly as Patton predicted. This counterfactual historical debate remains unresolvable. We cannot know what would have happened if American leadership had followed Patton's advice. What we can evaluate is why they rejected it. Political leaders weren't simply naive or cowardly. They were managing complex domestic and international constraints that military logic alone couldn't address. They were trying to build a stable post-war order through international institutions and economic reconstruction, rather than through military confrontation. They recognized that democracies cannot sustain prolonged military mobilization without public support, and that public would not support a new war against a recent ally. Patton's tragedy was that he was too right too early. His military genius allowed him to see the Soviet threat with perfect clarity in 1945, but his political limitations prevented him from understanding why immediate military confrontation was impossible. He was a warrior who believed wars should be fought to achieve decisive victory, not managed through political compromise and strategic patience. He couldn't accept that sometimes the necessary response to a threat is not to attack immediately, but to prepare for a long competition that might never become open warfare. The comparison with other prophetic figures is instructive. Winston Churchill also warned about Soviet expansion, delivering his famous Iron Curtain speech in March 1946. But Churchill, unlike Patton, was a political leader who understood how to frame his warnings in ways that built support rather than alienated it. He advocated for containment and alliance building, not immediate attack. He recognized that changing policy required changing minds, not just issuing orders. Churchill's warnings were eventually heeded because he knew how to make them politically viable. Another comparison is with George Kennan, the diplomat whose long telegram from Moscow in 1946 provided the intellectual foundation for containment policy. Kennan understood Soviet ideology and behavior as clearly as Patton did, but he proposed patient, persistent resistance rather than military confrontation. His strategy acknowledged that democracies have different strengths than totalitarian states: economic productivity, technological innovation, cultural appeal, and should compete on those dimensions rather than purely military ones. Kennan's strategy was adopted because it fit the political and economic realities of post-war America. Patton could never have written anything like the long telegram. His mind worked in military terms: formations, logistics, offensive operations, decisive battles. He couldn't imagine winning a conflict through economic competition or cultural appeal. He saw the Soviet Union as an enemy army that needed to be defeated in combat, not as a political system that might eventually collapse from internal contradictions. His genius was limited to warfare, and warfare alone. The institutional response to Patton revealed tensions inherent in civil-military relations during crisis. Democratic governments require military leaders who provide honest assessments of threats and capabilities, including assessments that challenge political preferences. But democracies also require civilian control of policy decisions and respect for political constraints on military action. When military leaders cross the line from providing advice to publicly advocating policies contrary to civilian direction, they undermine democratic governance, regardless of the merit of their arguments. Patton crossed that line repeatedly and unapologetically. He believed his duty to speak truth about military threats superseded his obligation to support official policy. He thought political leaders were sacrificing national security for political convenience, and that his warnings might prevent future catastrophe. From his perspective, loyalty to country required disloyalty to superiors pursuing dangerous policies. This reasoning, while sincere, was incompatible with democratic governance requiring subordination of military to civilian authority. The challenge for democratic societies is maintaining space for military leaders to raise uncomfortable concerns while preventing military interference in political decisions. Eisenhower managed this tension throughout his career by distinguishing between private advocacy and public support. He would argue forcefully in private meetings, but support final decisions publicly. Patton never mastered this distinction. He believed that if private warnings went unheeded, public warnings became necessary. This belief, though understandable, was fundamentally incompatible with his position as subordinate military commander. The broader context of 1945 makes Patton's position more understandable, even if it remained unworkable. The American people had been mobilized for total war for 4 years. Hundreds of thousands had died, millions had served in uniform. The industrial economy had been converted to war production. Families had endured rationing, separation, and uncertainty. The sacrifices had been justified by the goal of defeating fascism and establishing lasting peace. Asking the American people to immediately begin preparing for another war contradicted everything they had been told and everything they had sacrificed for. Patton understood the military dimension, but not the social dimension. He saw that Soviet threat was real and immediate. He didn't appreciate that American society needed time to transition from total war to sustainable peacetime mobilization. The Cold War military establishment that eventually emerged, standing armies, permanent alliances, sustained high defense budgets, forward deployments, required years to build both the institutional structures and the public consensus necessary to support it. Demanding that infrastructure immediately in 1945 was asking for something that couldn't exist, regardless of the merit of the strategic argument. George S. Patton died believing he had failed. His warnings had been ignored, his command taken away, his reputation damaged. He faced death paralyzed, unable to move, dependent on others for every basic function, a humiliating end for a man who prided himself on physical courage and independence. In his final conscious moments, he reportedly said to his wife, Beatrice, "This is a hell of a way to die." It wasn't the warrior's death he had always imagined, falling in combat against worthy enemies. It was random, meaningless, and anticlimactic. But history vindicated Patton in ways he couldn't have imagined. Everything he predicted came true. The Soviet Union did become America's enemy. Eastern Europe did fall under brutal communist control. The Cold War did define the next half-century of human history. The military strength that Patton advocated did prove necessary to contain Soviet expansion. The warnings he issued in 1945 became the foundation of American strategic thinking for 2 generations. The establishment that dismissed him as unstable and reckless eventually adopted his strategic assessment while rejecting his tactical recommendations. They built the military alliances he advocated. They maintained the military presence in Europe he demanded. They rearmed Germany as he suggested, though not as quickly or as extensively as he wanted. They recognized that Soviet communism represented an existential threat requiring permanent vigilance and substantial military capability. Everything except immediate military confrontation in 1945 became official policy. Was Patton right? The answer depends on what question you're asking. Was he right that the Soviet Union would become America's enemy? Absolutely. Was he right that confronting the Soviets would eventually become necessary? Yes. Was he right that delay would occur under less favorable circumstances? Partially. Some American advantages eroded with time, but other advantages emerged. Was he right that immediate military attack in 1945 was necessary? This remains debatable and unknowable. What cannot be debated is Patton's courage in speaking uncomfortable truths, regardless of personal consequences. He knew his warnings would cost him his command. He knew they would destroy his reputation. He knew they violated military protocol, requiring subordinate officers to support official policy. He spoke anyway because he believed the threat was real and the cost of silence too great. Whether he was right or wrong about the solution, he was undoubtedly right about the problem, and he paid dearly for having the courage to say so. The tragedy of Patton's final months illuminates fundamental tensions in democratic governance during crisis. Democracies require military leaders who will speak truthfully about threats and military necessities, but democracies also require civilian control of military policy and respect for political constraints on military action. Patton represented pure military logic untempered by political awareness. His superiors represented political necessity inadequately informed by military reality. Both perspectives were necessary, neither alone was sufficient. In the decades following Patton's death, the institutions he distrusted, NATO, the United Nations, diplomatic negotiations, economic aid programs, proved remarkably effective at achieving the objectives he sought through military means. The Soviet Union was contained without World War III. Eastern Europe eventually gained freedom without the massive casualties Patton's proposed 1945 campaign would have produced. Germany became a prosperous democracy and a bulwark against Soviet expansion, exactly as Patton envisioned, but through reconstruction rather than rearming prisoners of war. The outcome was better than Patton imagined possible through non-military means. Yet we must ask whether these peaceful victories were only possible because men like Patton established credible military deterrence. Would Stalin have respected diplomatic agreements without American military power backing them? Would NATO have maintained cohesion without the possibility of military response to Soviet aggression? Would the Soviet Union have eventually collapsed, if not contained by military alliances and defense spending that drained communist economies? The answer is almost certainly no. The peaceful resolution of the Cold War required both the diplomatic tools Patton dismissed and the military strength he advocated. This suggests that Patton's legacy is more complex than simple vindication or condemnation. He was right about the threat, right about the need for military strength, right about Soviet intentions, and right about the danger of wishful thinking regarding Stalin's willingness to honor agreements. He was probably wrong about the necessity of immediate military confrontation, wrong about the feasibility of using rearmed Germans, and wrong about the ability to quickly defeat Soviet forces. He was definitely wrong about how to communicate his concerns in ways that would be politically effective. The establishment that silenced Patton wasn't wrong to relieve him of command. A theater commander who publicly contradicts official policy and advocates unauthorized military action against a nominal ally cannot retain command regardless of the merit of his arguments. Military discipline requires subordination to civilian authority, even when military judgment conflicts with political decision-making. Patton crossed lines that could not be uncrossed, and his relief was both justified and necessary. But that same establishment should have listened more carefully to the substance of Patton's warnings, even while disciplining him for insubordination. The fact that he was wrong about process didn't mean he was wrong about content. The fact that his proposed solution was unworkable didn't mean his problem identification was inaccurate. Leadership requires the wisdom to extract valuable intelligence from uncomfortable sources and to separate the messenger from the message. The deepest lesson of Patton's final months is that seeing clearly is necessary but insufficient. Patton saw the Soviet threat with perfect clarity, but he lacked the political skills to effectively communicate that vision or to propose solutions that were politically feasible. He was a military genius with the political awareness of a junior officer. In a democracy, that combination is both valuable and dangerous. Valuable because someone needs to speak military truth regardless of political convenience. Dangerous because military logic, untempered by political reality, can lead to catastrophic decisions. Modern military leaders face similar tensions. They must provide honest military advice about threats and capabilities while respecting civilian authority over policy decisions. They must warn about dangers without engaging in insubordination. They must advocate for necessary military capabilities without exceeding their proper role in democratic governance. The balance is delicate and difficult, requiring both moral courage and political wisdom. Patton possessed the moral courage in abundance. He died believing that virtue was sufficient. History suggests that courage without wisdom, like wisdom without courage, achieves incomplete results. The ideal military leader combines Patton's clarity of vision and willingness to speak unpleasant truths with political awareness sufficient to make those truths persuasive rather than merely provocative. Such combinations are rare, which is why leadership remains difficult and why societies continue struggling to balance military necessity against democratic governance. George S. Patton died 79 years ago, but his story remains relevant because the fundamental tensions he embodied persist. We still face adversaries whose intentions we must assess accurately, despite political pressure for optimism. We still struggle to balance military preparedness against other national priorities. We still debate how much influence military leaders should have over policy versus strictly military operations. We still face leaders who see clearly but speak ineffectively, and leaders who speak persuasively but see poorly. The establishment called Patton unstable and relieved him of command. History called him prescient and validated his warnings. Both verdicts contained truth. He was unstable, not mentally ill, but politically unreliable and unwilling to moderate his behavior to political necessities. He was prescient, seeing Soviet threat years before others accepted it, predicting Cold War dynamics with remarkable accuracy, understanding that strategic competition would define the post-war era. In the end, Patton was exactly what he appeared to be: a brilliant military commander, a difficult subordinate, a prophetic voice speaking uncomfortable truths, and a politically naive warrior who couldn't distinguish between military genius and political wisdom. His life teaches that clarity of vision matters, that speaking truth requires courage, that sometimes being right early is worse than being right late, and that democracies need both military genius and political wisdom, preferably in the same person, but if necessary in creative tension between different leaders with different gifts. The man who predicted a Soviet invasion in 1945 and was labeled unstable for his trouble deserves better than simple vindication or condemnation. He deserves honest assessment, acknowledging both his gifts and his limitations, his brilliant strategic vision and his catastrophic political judgment, his moral courage and his personal flaws. He deserves recognition that being right about the problem doesn't automatically mean you're right about the solution, and that sometimes the greatest service a military leader can provide is forcing political leaders to confront uncomfortable realities, even if his proposed response must be rejected. George Patton forced American leadership to think seriously about Soviet threat at precisely the moment they wanted to celebrate victory and pursue peace. That service was invaluable, even though his specific recommendations were unworkable. He initiated a conversation about Soviet intentions that eventually produced effective containment strategy. He was the spark that ignited better thinking by others, even though his own thinking was incomplete. That role, prophet, irritant, catalyst, truth-teller, may be his most important legacy, more significant than his undeniable military genius or his tragic final months. The general who predicted the Cold War and paid with his command and ultimately his life represents something essential about democratic governance during crisis: the need for voices willing to speak uncomfortable truths regardless of personal cost, combined with the need for political wisdom to translate those truths into effective policy. Patton provided the former, but lacked the latter. The establishment he criticized lacked the former, but eventually achieved the latter. Together, despite mutual hostility and misunderstanding, they produced the strategy that contained Soviet expansion and eventually won the Cold War without the catastrophic military confrontation Patton feared was inevitable. That outcome, victory through patience rather than immediate attack, success through alliance building rather than unilateral military action, triumph through institutional development rather than battlefield glory, was everything Patton's warrior spirit rejected. Yet it vindicated his core insight that Soviet communism represented an existential threat requiring sustained resistance. The irony is perfect. The general who was right about the war was wrong about how to fight it, but his warnings ensured others found better methods to achieve the objectives he identified. George S. Patton would have hated that irony. He wanted glory in battle, not gradual victory through diplomatic and economic competition. He wanted to die leading cavalry charges, not paralyzed in a hospital bed. He wanted recognition during life, not vindication after death. He got none of those things. What he got instead was something potentially more valuable. He forced his nation to confront a threat it desperately wanted to ignore, paid the price for that service, and ultimately contributed to a strategic vision that preserved everything he valued, even though it rejected his recommended methods. That's not the warrior's death Patton imagined. It's something better: the prophet's vindication, the teacher's legacy, and the patriot's genuine contribution to national security despite personal defeat. Sometimes the greatest victories are the ones we don't live to see, achieved through methods we never would have chosen, vindicating insights we were punished for expressing. That was Patton's final campaign, fought after his death, won through strategies he never understood, but resting entirely on the clarity of vision that cost him everything. The establishment laughed and labeled him unstable. History proved him right. Both those things are true and both matter. Understanding why requires grappling with the complexity of military genius, the demands of democratic governance, and the eternal tension between seeing clearly and acting effectively. Patton saw clearly. Others acted effectively. Together, despite never understanding each other, they saved the world from Soviet domination. That's not a simple story of vindication or tragedy. It's something more subtle and more valuable. A lesson in how democracies stumble toward wisdom through the creative tension between competing perspectives, neither sufficient alone but together, producing outcomes better than either could achieve independently. George S. Patton predicted a Soviet invasion that never came, precisely because his warnings helped create the military strength and strategic clarity that made that invasion impossible. The prophet, who was labeled unstable, made his prophecy untrue through the very act of speaking it, forcing a response that prevented what he predicted. That paradox defines his legacy and explains why his story remains essential 80 years after his death, teaching lessons about leadership, democracy, and strategy that remain as relevant today as they were in that bitter summer of 1945, when a difficult general spoke dangerous truths and paid with everything he valued.